Hey there, it's Ben Hassel here, and for those of you that watched the first of this series of 2 tutorials about creating these smooth style plugins in Final Cut Pro 10, you'll have seen the Premium VFX Smooth Titles plugin available from FX Factory, who are kindly sponsoring this video. But in this tutorial, we're going to look at how we create this style of plugin on our own. So we're going to have a look at how we animate the type, animate the masks, how we create text and color that we can modify within Final Cut Pro 10, and how we publish those plugins from Apple Motion to Final Cut Pro 10. So we're going to move away from Final Cut Pro 10 for the moment and jump into Apple Motion. So basically Apple Motion is Apple's equivalent of After Effects. If you've ever used After Effects for animating or creating special effects, then Apple Motion fits into the workflow in exactly the same way. Now, the nice thing about Apple Motion is that we can really easily create our own plugins for Final Cut Pro 10. So if you need to create plugins where you need to have control over the design, where you need to match the color and the layout and type design for a particular project, then Apple Motion has all of that built into it. So the first thing we'll do is just go to File and New. And when you create a new project in Apple Motion, you have 5 choices, or 5 main choices here. You have an effect, a generator, a transition, and we are going to create a Final Cut Pro 10 title. Now, I'm going to work in 29.97 frames per second NTSC. That's the frame rate that I'm shooting most of my footage within, and in broadcast HD. And for this title, we're going to create a duration that is 5 seconds long. So I'm just going to type in 5 period here, which is going to give me that 5 seconds. Now, really, we only need maybe a second or a little bit more for the in animation and a second or more for the out animation, and we'll look at how to set that all up. And we can stretch this animation beyond 5 seconds once we get it onto the Final Cut Pro 10 timeline with those 1 second animations as kind of bookends at either end of the title. So once that's all set up, we'll click Open. And first thing we're going to do is just go straight away to File and Save As. And basically, I'm going to save this into My Titles. We'll call this Smooth Title New. And we're going to drop it into My Titles. It doesn't have a theme or anything for this. And then we will publish that. So we've published that into Final Cut Pro 10. It doesn't really do anything yet. But when we open Final Cut Pro 10, we'll actually see that in the list of plugins. Now, we don't need the title background here. So we can delete that. And then we can select our text layer here. So this is kind of default text layer, and we can drag this up and we can move it around. Now I want to trim down this text layer in size just so it's kind of a small box in the middle. So I'm actually going to double click into this. You just need to make sure you have the select transform tool selected here when you double click, and that will allow you to kind of change the size of this box. So we'll drop it down to this sort of size, and then I'm going to come into my inspector on the top left. And in the inspector, we have the kind of type properties. So you can see under text here and format, we have all the same kind of 2D styles and everything like that we have available in Final Cut Pro 10. So I'm just going to drag across and select all my type, and we will select the bold type here. And we're going to change a couple things. So I'm going to change this to demi bold. I'm going to drop down the size, and I'm just going to increase the tracking just a little bit so we've got some nice space between those letters. And then you can see at the moment this is kind of offset from the middle here. So if we come across the properties here, you can see my anchor point is set to 864 and 50. I just want to set that to 0 and 0. And basically that means the anchor is at the bottom left there. And it just makes it easier sometimes to have that set like that for moving things around a little bit later. It won't matter too much for this particular tutorial. So we'll leave that kind of in the middle there. We'll look for it to snap right in the middle there. And so that's basically the kind of main part of our text layer. And if you've not used Apple Motion before, basically we're going to be doing a few different things here. We're going to be adding some more layers and groups down here for the graphic elements, so for the shapes that sit behind our text. We're going to be adding some masks, and then we'll also be using some of the behaviors to kind of animate things in and out as well. So the first thing we're going to do is kind of set up the final layout we want once the animation is complete. So there's only one thing I really want to make sure here, and that is that my playhead is at the beginning here. And that just means that anything that I add here will begin at the start of my timeline here. So if we come to the middle toolbar here in Apple Motion, I'm going to grab the rectangle tool. If you don't see the rectangle tool, you might want to drop down and switch from the circle to the rectangle. And we are going to just stretch this out behind that text. or in front of the text for the moment. And then across on the inspector here, we're going to come to our shape options, and I'm going to change the fill color. So I'm going to drop down this arrow, and we're going to select, we'll go for this nice kind of blue fill color. And in my layers, either down in the timeline or up in the layers up here, we just want to drag that behind. So basically we can see now that shape behind our text. Now what I want to do is just make sure this is aligned centrally, and then I want to add that angle to the ends of this shape. In order to do that, I need to change it from being a rectangle to being a Bezier shape. So basically if I come up to the geometry here, I can go to convert to points. And basically this is going to convert this from a rectangle to just a Bezier shape. So it's still going to look exactly the same. But what this means is once we've converted it to points, we can select the 2 points at the top here. So I'm going to hold down Shift to do this. And then we can move them so I get that kind of nice offset here. So basically we're creating that kind of angled look for our box. And then what I'm going to do, I want to create the box across to the right here. And I'm going to do all this before I do any animation so that everything is set up right. I'm going to right click on my layer here and just duplicate that. And then I'll just move this top layer, my rectangle copy, to the right. And then I'm going to select these 2 control points on the left of that new layer, holding down Shift, and just drag those to the right. And you can see those yellow guides are kind of making sure I snap everything into position. So you can see now I've got that kind of nice angled rectangle across on the right, and it has the same angle as the other elements that I've got. So what I want to happen when I actually start to animate this is that my animation acts as kind of bookends to the text animation and the graphic animation that I'm doing. So I'm going to come to around 1 second here, and I'm going to do Shift and M, and that's going to add a marker here on my timeline. If I just do M, it's going to add it to one of my layers. So I'm going to right click there and go to Edit Marker. And this is a really important step. So basically we want the type of this bookmark to be an optional build-in, and what that means is that we'll get the option to run the animation for our title in Final Cut Pro 10. It will kind of automatically publish that. So I'll click OK, and then I'm going to come to the end of my animation here, and just at 4 seconds I'm going to do Shift and tap M again, and then right click on this marker. We'll go to edit that, and we are going to make this an optional build out. So build out optional, and basically what that means now is that this will hold in the middle of my animation. So any animation that I do here is the build-in, and if I extend my clip on the Final Cut Pro 10 timeline, it's not going to change the duration of that animation. It's not going to kind of stretch it as I stretch things out. So now we can begin to animate, but I want to move things into groups before we do that. So I want the rectangle to be in its own group, and I want the text to be in its own group. So I'm going to come to Object, make a new group. It's going to make a new group up at the top here, and I'm going to drag my text into there, and then I'm going to just click on the project, go to Object, New Group. And the reason I click on the project is if I have a group selected, it's going to make a group within that project. And I'm just going to drag this one down, and make sure when you drag this down that you don't nest it. So you can see there's 2 spots where I can drop that group. I want it to be the spot to the left so that it actually is independent of the other groups, and we'll drag that rectangle copy to there. So we're just keeping things separate. It kind of makes a difference if you do some types of animation in Apple Motion to have things in separate layers. So I'm going to have a text group, I'm going to have graphics right group, and I'm going to have a graphics main group. And then we'll just come up to the toolbar here and just stretch this out so we can see those layers. So basically now I want to have some animation in here. So if I save this, at the moment, if we come into Final Cut Pro 10, you can see I'll come to this last clip. If I come into my titles, I have my smooth title new. I can drag this down to the timeline, and I have the title but no animation. So you can see straight away we have a title we can work with. So we can come into the type options, I can change my type, and I can kind of modify all the different type elements down here. So the size and the color of the type, and then a variety of other things. So we've got the beginnings of our plugin made. Now we'll come back to Apple Motion and we're going to set up the intro animation here. So basically what I want to happen is for this main graphic to be revealed by a mask. So basically if I come here, select my rectangle, this is the rectangle in the background. If you want to check your layers, you can just hit the check mark to the left of them and make sure you're on the right one. And I'm going to come to my mask options across here. So I'm going to choose my rectangle mask. And I'll draw this out and we'll stretch that out, and you can see straight away that it's masking it. And then in my mask options I'm going to convert that to points, hit convert, and then I can set this at that same angle. So I'm just going to nudge this around a little bit until I get that angle just right. We'll move that back. So because it's going to happen quickly, I'm not too worried about the detail of the angle as long as it's close. So basically now we can animate this and we can reveal that background. Okay, so I'm going to leave this in the position that I want it to finish in. I'm going to come across to my properties and add a keyframe for the position. And then I'm going to come ahead in time, add a keyframe for my position at the end of the animation, and I can modify the timing of these keyframes. 1 second, which is what this is at the moment, might be a little bit long. And I'm going to come back to that first keyframe. So if I use the left hand previous keyframe button here, I'm coming back to that very first keyframe, which is important. So now I could move either these two control points on the right, or I can just drag this whole thing to the left. And now we have our first little bit of animation that's going to reveal that opener, which actually looks pretty good. So we can use a mask to animate that element. And so with this rectangle mask that's applied to the background rectangle, if I select this on my layers, I can drag it up to my text layer, and it is going to mask out the text as well. So you can see it's masking out the text at the same time, although I might want to offset it. So for instance, my rectangle, my text is kind of a little bit ahead of my rectangle there. So actually what I can do here is if I just pull the animation back a little bit, so I'm moving that last keyframe on the timeline, that is slowing it down. So now my text is animating on just after that graphic, and I can change the timing of this as well. So we can offset it. You'll find that once you start to do these types of animations, you'll find a little bit of a rhythm and a flow in the animations, and we can just learn that as we go. So you'll think about the timing and pace of stuff, but we can always change that by dragging these keyframes. So we've got our animation there. So if we save that and then come back to Final Cut Pro, we can delete this original smooth title new graphic from the timeline and drag down this. We'll always need to replace it in Final Cut Pro 10. It doesn't update automatically on the timeline. But now you can see I've got my build in there, and we have begun to kind of make this animation. So let's jump back to motion. We're going to animate this guy on the right. So I'm going to close some of these up, and we're looking for the graphics on the right here. So the rectangle copy. And for this, I'm going to get this to start to animate in when I'm about halfway or close to the end maybe of my animation here. So somewhere around about here, I want this right hand element to appear. But I want it to kind of lock into place right at the end at the right spot, so just as this animation finishes. So I'm going to add a keyframe for the position here. So we'll come up to our inspector with this rectangle copy layer selected. We'll come to the properties, and for the position we'll add a keyframe. And animating kind of backwards, so setting up where you want the animation to finish and then going back in time, which I'm doing now, is always easier than trying to get things in the right position later on. So now if I move this to the right, you can see we get this, and then a nice little pop into place of that graphic on the right. We can just stretch that back a little bit. So what I'm going to do now in this time is we're going to come to our library. We're going to come up to our behaviors and into basic motion, and we're looking for this fade in, fade out. So basically if I drag this onto my rectangle, you can see I've got a fade in, fade out there, which is basically going to fade it in. And if I bring it to the very first keyframe of my animation here, with that layer selected, I can press I, that's going to mark it in, and that's going to play in, and then at the end here, it's going to fade out. Okay, so in that last second you can see it fading out. So throughout this area in the middle, it is just holding. So we'll save that, and we're going to come up to our text here. We'll open this up, and we've got our text fading in, and then if we come to the fade out for the text here, so this kind of area at the end of our text layer for our type, so we're going to come down to our text sequence and text basic. We're going to look for fade characters left out. So basically if I drag this to my type here, I can trim this down a little bit on the timeline, and we'll just move this to the end so you can see it's attached to that type layer, and basically I can now get that text to fade out at the end. So it animates in, holds, and at the end the text fades out. And actually I'm going to shorten this so that this fades out a bit sooner. And we will end this around about here. So I'm faded this out up to this point. I'm going to select my rectangle copy here and then press O. It's going to mark an out point. And basically now, drag this back one frame. You can see it fades out. Nicely. And we just need to now fade out our other rectangle. So I'm going to minimize my text and my graphics on the right, and now we're going to work on this rectangle. So for the rectangle on the right, we'll use this same rectangle mask. So if I come to the end here, I'm going to come to my inspector, and in my position properties I'll create a keyframe, and then I'll come here and I'll get this to kind of follow the text. So by this point right at the end we have moved that off. So if I drag this to the right now, we have animated that off. So if we play this through, we animate on, lock into place, and at the end we animate off and fade out. And I've just got a little bit of tidying up to fix with my type. So I'm going to have this animate off a little bit slower. So you could just see a little shadow of type there. So I'm going to come to my text and we'll just shorten this so they've disappeared by this point. So let's play that through. Text animates off, and then you can see the text flashes on after we've done the fade out. So again, we just need to grab the text layer and trim it down so it's the same duration as the fade. And then at the beginning of this graphics on the right, we also need to trim this down at the beginning here so we don't get that little flash of the graphic on the right. So let's just stretch our layers out here. So basically you can see we've got the text layer with the rectangle mask on it that's revealing it at the beginning, and then to fade that out at the end we've got the fade characters left out. Then we have our rectangle copy, which is our animation on the right. So that's that animation on the right coming in and then fading out at the end. And then we have here our rectangle mask for our main kind of blue shape coming across there. So let's save that. If we come into Final Cut Pro now, and we'll delete our smooth title new and re-add it to the timeline, you can see now we have that animation locks into place and everything is looking pretty good. So we can modify our text. We can change obviously the color of the text and stuff, but we can't yet change anything apart from turning on and off the build in and build out. So we need to publish the color of our background here. So we come back to motion. I'm going to select my rectangles here, my rectangle copy first, and I'm going to come to the shape options and the style, and we are going to publish the fill color. So basically if I drop down on the right there, I can publish that fill color, save that, come back to my rectangle in the background, come to my style, and then we can also publish the fill color for that too. So if I save this and we come back to Final Cut Pro, we can delete this and drop the new one down at the timeline, and then we can play that through, and now you can see up in the inspector under the title options here we can change the color, so we can pick out a different color for each of those different elements. Okay, and obviously we can add more layers in there. We can stretch out our animation here, so if we stretch this out, play this through now, you can see we've got that nice animate in, and then also at the end we've got that nice animate out. Now the only thing we don't have built into our plugin is a lot of the controls. If you had a look at the Smooth Titles plugin that we get when we're actually working with these premium VFX plugins. So we have control over the color and the build in and build out, and obviously once we've learned how to make these we can go back into Apple Motion and refine things, but we don't have that kind of quick control that you get in some of the more advanced plugins that you can purchase. But this is a great option if you want to design your own plugins, learn Apple Motion, or don't have the budget for plugins. So definitely Apple Motion is worth learning. Now one thing we have in the premium VFX plugin is the overlay effects, but we can quite easily create that effect in Final Cut Pro 10. So if I select the clip in the background here, I'm going to come to my color options, and basically in the color correction we can kind of modify these effects. So I'm going to come a little bit into here when the animation has happened, and what I'll normally do when I'm trying to make text pop is I will either increase or decrease the brightness here, and then mute the color a little bit. So basically what that means is dragging my blacks up and my whites down, and my grays either up or down depending on what kind of title I'm using. And you can see when we start to do this, we remove the contrast from that background image, which makes that title stand out a lot more. Now we can animate this as well. So if I add a keyframe here and then come back to the beginning, I've got my video selected. I'm just going to type in 0 for all these options to send them back to the default exposure. And now you can see we get that nice little dropping back of the background. And we can do the same at the end. So basically if I come to the end, I can add a keyframe to hold it at that position, and then we can come to when the animation is finished, and we can type in zeros all the way through here, and that will then revert back to the normal color. So you can see we get the animation in and out of those colors. So again, super simple to kind of create these plugins in Apple Motion, and then also to kind of add these effects for your video as well. The main factor here is time, whether you choose to kind of buy a plugin or create your own. And also it's fun to learn how to kind of make these plugins as well. So depending on the project, if I have time, I'll often try and make the plugins myself. If I don't, then sometimes it's head to the FX Factory store and try and find something that will finish the project off quickly. So hopefully this little mini series of tutorials on how to create these type of animated effects has been useful. If you have any questions about creating animations like this in Final Cut Pro 10 or using Apple Motion, then please leave a comment below. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you on the next tutorial, and hope you have some fun making your own plugins in Apple Motion.